Aryan Mehra, an alpha architect known for his precision and dominance in the field, found himself sitting across from Kian Sharma, a beta architect whose casual attitude and unconventional ideas irritated him. The high-profile project they were both assigned to seemed like the perfect opportunity for Aryan to solidify his place as the top architect in the city, but Kian's presence was an obstacle he hadn't anticipated. The tension in the air was thick, neither willing to yield to the other. Kian, unbothered by Aryan's icy stare, leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. "We're going to have to work together, whether you like it or not," he said, his tone more confident than Aryan was comfortable with. This project could make or break both our careers. He was all too aware of the pressure, but he wasn't intimidated by Aryan's alpha energy. Aryan's eyes narrowed. "I don't need a partner who thinks this is some kind of creative playground," he retorted. "I work with structure, with detail. If you can't keep up, then maybe you're in the wrong room." The words slipped out before he could stop them, but he couldn't help it. He was used to being in control. Kian's lips quirked into a smirk. "Let's just see if we can actually make this work," he replied, unfazed. The challenge in his eyes told Aryan that this partnership would be more than just a professional one. It would become a battlefield. And despite himself, Aryan felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, buried beneath the animosity. Aryan and Kian's first day of collaboration was a disaster. They were tasked with brainstorming ideas for a high-rise building, but their differing approaches created nothing but conflict. Aryan's vision was precise, focused on functionality and structure, while Kian's ideas were more abstract, with a focus on aesthetics. Every suggestion Kian made felt like an attack on Aryan's carefully crafted plans, while Kian found Aryan's obsession with detail suffocating. As they argued over design elements, neither was willing to back down. "This needs to have flow," Kian insisted, his hands sweeping through the air. "It can't just be a box with windows." Aryan glared, his jaw tightening. "And flow doesn't work without a solid foundation, something you seem to overlook." The sharpness in his voice was evident, but Kian only shrugged, unaffected. After hours of arguing with no real progress, the project manager intervened. "This isn't helping anyone," they said firmly. "You two need to compromise. Work together, or this project will be reassigned." The ultimatum hung in the air, and for the first time, Aryan realized that Kian wasn't just a nuisance. He was a challenge, one he couldn't ignore. Neither man was ready to back down, but they had no choice but to continue working together. The tension between them simmered, neither man willing to admit that perhaps, just perhaps, the partnership could work. But it was clear, this was only the beginning of their strained journey together. As the days wore on, Aryan and Kian's rivalry only deepened. Their meetings became battlegrounds, with every idea from Kian countered by Aryan's firm rebuttals. Yet, amidst the conflict, there were fleeting moments of unspoken understanding, tiny cracks in their wall of animosity that neither was willing to acknowledge. They began to notice patterns in each other's work, subtle hints of brilliance that they couldn't ignore. Kian had an uncanny ability to see the bigger picture, something Aryan had to admit was valuable, even if it annoyed him. He found himself grudgingly impressed by Kian's willingness to challenge the status quo, pushing for innovation at every turn. Still, that didn't mean he was ready to accept Kian's way of thinking. "Your ideas are wild," Aryan remarked one afternoon, "but they lack the discipline this project needs." Kian, ever the optimist, wasn't discouraged. "Discipline is important, but so is creativity," he shot back. "You can't have one without the other." There was a slight edge to his voice now, a crack in his usual confidence that caught Aryan's attention. He didn't like the vulnerability it hinted at, but at the same time, he couldn't help but wonder why he was so drawn to it. The day ended with no resolution, but something had shifted. Despite the tension, there was an undeniable pull between them, something neither could explain. It was a dangerous undercurrent, one that would soon demand their attention. The next few days were a blur of endless revisions and tension-filled meetings. Aryan and Kian seemed to be locked in a never-ending cycle of disagreement, but beneath the surface, their dynamic was slowly evolving. Kian noticed Aryan's sharp attention to detail, the way his mind worked with mechanical precision. For a brief moment, he admired Aryan's commitment, even if it wasn't enough to prevent him from challenging every idea. But Kian wasn't one to back down either. He pushed forward, suggesting elements that challenged Aryan's approach. "You're stuck in your comfort zone," Kian said during one meeting, his voice steady but pointed. "You don't want to think outside the box. Let's break the mold." Aryan's gaze darkened. He hated being told what to do, especially by someone so unpredictable. But to his surprise, Aryan found himself considering Kian's words. Maybe there was some merit to the chaos Kian seemed to thrive in. Maybe, just maybe, their clash of ideas could lead to something neither of them had expected. "Fine," Aryan grumbled. "Let's see what happens when you push the boundaries." In that moment, the foundation of their partnership began to shift. They still hated each other's methods, but for the first time, they began to respect the other's strengths, even if they weren't ready to admit it. It was a small step forward, but it was enough to leave both men wondering just how much their growing connection could change their approach to the project. As the project progressed, Aryan and Kian fell into a rhythm, albeit a strained one. They still argued, often loudly, but now there was a strange balance between them. Aryan would present a meticulous plan, and Kian would throw in wild ideas that pushed Aryan's boundaries. They'd bicker, but then somehow, they'd find a way to make it work, often after hours of debating. It wasn't just their professional relationship that began to shift. The tension between them started to spill over into their personal interactions, much to both their dismay. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when their eyes lingered longer than they should have. A brush of hands during a meeting. A shared look that neither could explain. The attraction was undeniable, but neither was willing to acknowledge it. "Do you always have to make everything a challenge?" Kian asked one evening, his voice softer than usual. Aryan glanced up, a frown on his face. "What do you mean?" he replied, his tone guarded. Kian hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. You make it impossible to just get along." Aryan's chest tightened. He didn't know how to respond. He was an alpha. He wasn't supposed to feel this way, not about someone like Kian. But as the days passed, Aryan found himself thinking about those moments. He couldn't deny that something was happening between them, something that neither of them had planned for. And in the back of his mind, he wondered how long they could keep pretending it wasn't there. Aryan's patience was wearing thin. The project was due in 2 weeks, and while they had made progress, Kian's constant interruptions were testing his limits. Each time they reached a new stage in the design, Kian would throw in a suggestion that challenged Aryan's established plans, and though part of Aryan respected his creativity, the other part resented the disruption. One day, after Kian's latest push to change an essential feature of the design, Aryan snapped. "You can't just keep throwing these ideas around without thinking of the consequences," he shouted, frustration lacing his voice. "This is a high-profile project, not your personal art project." The tension in the room thickened, and Kian, taken aback, stood frozen for a moment. Kian's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was no trace of his usual playful arrogance. "I'm just trying to make this better, Aryan," he said quietly, his voice edged with something darker. "But maybe you're right. Maybe I should just sit back and let you do everything your way." The sarcasm was palpable, but so was the hurt in his eyes. It was as if he had been waiting for Aryan to acknowledge the strain between them. The room fell silent. Aryan opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. In that brief moment, he realized something he didn't want to admit. Kian wasn't just an obstacle anymore. He was something else entirely, and that realization left Aryan shaken. The days that followed the confrontation were tense. Neither Aryan nor Kian spoke much, each buried in their work but constantly aware of the unspoken tension between them. Aryan was disturbed by the weight of Kian's words, especially the vulnerability he had seen in Kian's eyes. It was a side of Kian he hadn't expected, and it made Aryan question everything he had believed about him. One evening, as they sat reviewing the final plans, Kian broke the silence. "Look, I didn't mean to make you feel like I don't respect your work," he said, his tone surprisingly soft. "It's just, I've always been the one to push boundaries, and I thought maybe you could see things from a different angle." Aryan glanced at him, startled by the sincerity in Kian's voice. Kian continued, his gaze dropping to the papers in front of him. "I get it, though. You have a vision, and I respect that. Maybe I've been a little too eager to change everything." His words hung in the air, and Aryan felt a strange tug at his chest. He didn't know what to make of this sudden shift in Kian's demeanor, but it was the first time they were speaking as equals rather than adversaries. Without thinking, Aryan nodded. I didn't mean to dismiss your ideas either, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I've been too focused on control. The admission felt foreign, but freeing. It was the first step toward understanding that the tension between them wasn't just about their work, it was about something more. The following days were quieter, though the tension still lingered. Aryan and Kian began to settle into a tentative truce, their professional interactions now smoother, though tinged with unspoken understanding. The cracks in their earlier rivalry had softened, but something more complicated had taken root between them, an undeniable pull neither could quite explain. Late one night, as they were going over final details for the project, Kian brushed against Aryan's hand, an accidental touch that sent a jolt through Aryan's body. It was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. Kian quickly pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable, and Aryan felt his heart rate increase. His mind raced with questions he wasn't ready to answer. You okay? Kian asked, his voice strangely gentle, as if he sensed the shift in the air. Aryan swallowed, trying to steady his breath. Yeah, he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. Just tired. Kian nodded, but neither of them made a move to break the growing silence. It wasn't just the project anymore, it was something else, something unspoken. As they parted for the night, Aryan found himself replaying the touch over and over again in his mind. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but it was there, undeniable and confusing. For the first time, he was beginning to wonder if their rivalry had been something more all along. Days turned into weeks, and the final stages of the project loomed closer. Aryan and Kian's partnership had become something of a delicate balance. One moment, they were collaborators, the next, they were on the edge of something else. Aryan couldn't shake the feeling that the more time he spent with Kian, the more his own boundaries started to blur. The team had gathered for a final meeting to review the project before submission. Kian leaned in close, his breath warm against Aryan's ear as he pointed to a specific design element. The proximity sent a shiver down Aryan's spine, but he couldn't pull away. There was a magnetic force between them, one that neither could escape. Looks good, Kian said casually, though his voice was low, almost intimate. Aryan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, fixated on the feeling of Kian so near. Yeah, he replied, his voice betraying him with a slight crack. Kian caught it but didn't comment. Instead, he met Aryan's gaze, and for a moment, it felt as if the room had narrowed to just the two of them. The moment passed, but the tension didn't fade. As Aryan left the meeting, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was shifting, something that wasn't just about their work anymore. He wasn't sure how much longer he could deny it. The deadline for the project was fast approaching, and Aryan and Kian were putting in long hours. But despite their differences, they had reached a point of silent understanding. Their work was aligned, their ideas flowing more freely, and even their arguments had become less heated, more like a friendly exchange of ideas. However, the unspoken attraction between them had only deepened. One evening, as they worked late into the night, Kian glanced up from the plans and caught Aryan staring at him. The moment felt charged, and Aryan quickly looked away, his heart pounding. Kian didn't let it slide, though. He leaned forward, his expression softer than usual. What's going on, Aryan? He asked, his voice steady but curious. Aryan didn't answer right away. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply shook his head, his mind racing with thoughts he wasn't ready to confront. Nothing, he muttered, his voice quieter than before. Let's just finish this. But Kian didn't push it. Instead, he gave Aryan a small, knowing smile. Okay, he said, returning to the plans. And in that moment, Aryan realized that despite their rivalry, despite everything that had come between them, they had come to understand each other in a way that neither had expected. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close to it. The project was finally complete, and both men stood side by side, staring at the model they had created together. It was a masterpiece, one that neither could have achieved alone. The tension between them, though still present, had evolved into something more complex, something deeper. They had spent months together, pushing each other, arguing, but also building something meaningful. So we did it, Kian said, his voice surprisingly warm. Aryan nodded, though he didn't trust himself to speak. For the first time, there was no animosity between them, just a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had formed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. You did good, Aryan said, his voice low. Kian raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the compliment. You too, Kian replied, his tone just as soft. The words were simple, but they carried weight. It was the first time either of them had truly acknowledged the other as an equal in this project. As they stood there, side by side, Aryan realized that the feelings he had been trying to suppress for months weren't going away. They had crossed a line, and neither of them knew how to go back. But for now, the work was done, and they had won. What came next was a question neither of them had the answer to. The successful completion of the project was a milestone, but for Aryan and Kian, it was just the beginning of something far more complicated. The lines between professional respect and personal attraction had blurred beyond recognition, and both men found themselves navigating unfamiliar territory. The days after the presentation were filled with awkward silences and lingering glances that neither could escape. It was during a celebratory dinner with the rest of the team that the tension finally became unbearable. Aryan had been unusually quiet, his thoughts occupied by the strange emotions Kian had stirred in him. Kian, on the other hand, had been his usual charismatic self, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes that Aryan couldn't ignore. As the evening wore on, Aryan found himself alone with Kian in the corner of the room, both of them standing awkwardly beside the windows. The silence between them was heavy, and finally, Kian spoke up. "You know, this was more than just a project," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the room. Aryan didn't know how to respond. His heart raced as he met Kian's gaze. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but he held back. There were too many things left unsaid between them, too many feelings neither of them were ready to face. The next few days were filled with more of the same, strained interactions and hidden glances. Kian could feel the shift between them, but he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that had formed. Aryan was closed off, his usual intensity now tinged with something else, something Kian couldn't quite place. It left him frustrated, unsure of where he stood. During one particularly long meeting, Kian couldn't take it anymore. "What's going on with you, Aryan?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though the room was otherwise silent. Aryan didn't respond immediately, his eyes focused on the plans in front of him. Kian's patience wore thin. "I don't get you. 1 minute, you're this driven, perfect alpha, and the next, you're like this stranger." Aryan's jaw clenched, and he finally looked up, meeting Kian's eyes with a piercing intensity. "What do you want me to say, Kian?" His voice was tight, the frustration evident. "That I'm not just an alpha? That I'm not just a man who works and fights and wins?" Kian's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "I don't want anything from you," Kian said quietly, his words unexpected. "But maybe you should stop fighting whatever this is between us." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Aryan wasn't sure how to respond. The tension between Aryan and Kian was palpable. Each day, their interactions grew more fraught with unspoken emotions, and both men found themselves unable to focus entirely on their work. Every glance felt like an unintentional admission of something neither of them was ready to admit. One evening, after another long day of work, Aryan found himself in the office alone, staring at the blueprints they had worked so tirelessly on. The lines and measurements blurred before him as his thoughts wandered to Kian. He hated how much of his focus had shifted to the other man, but it was undeniable. The attraction, the confusion, the pull. When Kian entered the room, their eyes met, and for a split second, the world seemed to stop. Neither of them said anything, but the silence was enough to speak volumes. Kian walked over to Aryan's desk, his usual smirk replaced by a softer expression. "You look like you're about to implode," Kian remarked, his tone light but filled with a knowing undertone. "I don't know what to do with this," Aryan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "This thing between us." Kian's eyes softened, and he sat down across from Aryan. "Maybe it's not something to fix," Kian said quietly. "Maybe it's something we should just let happen." The simplicity of his words left Aryan speechless, and for the first time, he felt the walls around him begin to crumble. Despite the cracks in their armor, both Aryan and Kian remained hesitant to take the next step. The boundaries they had worked so hard to maintain were slipping, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Every interaction now felt charged with unspoken words, and the slightest touch seemed to send sparks flying. One afternoon, they found themselves alone in the office again, reviewing some last-minute revisions. As Aryan reached across the desk, his fingers brushed Kian's hand. The touch was brief, but it was enough to make Aryan's pulse spike. Kian looked up, his gaze intense. "You can't keep doing this," Kian said, his voice low. "Pretending it's not there." Aryan's throat went dry. "I'm not pretending anything," he replied, his voice sharp. I don't know what I'm doing." Kian tilted his head, a half-smile forming on his lips. "Neither do I," he said softly. "But maybe that's what makes it so dangerous." The air between them grew thick with unspoken possibilities, and neither man knew where this would lead. Kian leaned in just slightly, and Aryan's breath hitched. The proximity was unbearable, but neither of them pulled away. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one neither was sure they could win. The days following their exchange were filled with uncertainty. Aryan couldn't stop thinking about what had almost happened between him and Kian, but he couldn't bring himself to face it. His responsibilities, his role as an alpha, all of it felt so much more complicated now. Every time he saw Kian, a part of him wanted to reach out, to finally acknowledge what they both knew was growing between them. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, Kian stayed behind, lingering in the office as Aryan packed his things. When Aryan finally turned to leave, he found Kian standing in his way, an unreadable expression on his face. "We need to talk," Kian said quietly. Aryan's heart raced as he stood in front of Kian, their faces only inches apart. "About what?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Kian's gaze softened. "About us," he whispered. "What this is. And what it could be." The words hung in the air, and Aryan was left to wonder if he was ready to let go of everything that had defined him up until now. He had crossed the line once, but was he ready to cross it again, this time with no turning back? The days following their confrontation left Aryan restless, caught between desire and fear. He knew things between him and Kian were shifting, but he wasn't sure how to navigate it. Every interaction felt like a step closer to something he wasn't ready to face. They were partners in work, but the unspoken attraction between them was becoming undeniable. Kian, for his part, seemed equally conflicted. He kept his distance during the day, but his eyes would linger on Aryan, betraying the thoughts he didn't voice. It wasn't until late one night, when the office was quiet, that Aryan finally found the courage to address the tension between them. "We need to stop pretending," he said, his voice firm but quiet. Kian turned to him, his gaze intense. "Pretending about what?" he asked, his tone almost too calm. Aryan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "That this, whatever it is between us, isn't real. That it doesn't matter." Kian's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. "And what if it does?" The question hung in the air, unspoken answers between them. Aryan's heart raced, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't sure if he wanted to run or to stay and see where this path would lead. The silence between them was deafening, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the beginning of something new, something neither could escape. The following days were filled with tension, but a different kind than before. Aryan and Kian worked together seamlessly, but their every glance seemed loaded with meaning. The project was nearing its final stages, and despite the pressure, Aryan found himself more distracted by his growing feelings for Kian than by the work itself. Kian, ever perceptive, seemed to sense the change. During a late-night meeting, he placed his hand on Aryan's shoulder, a gesture that, though simple, made Aryan's breath catch in his throat. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Kian asked quietly, his voice filled with an understanding that made Aryan's walls crumble just a little more. "I can't help it," Aryan admitted, his voice strained. "This thing between us, it's not just about the work anymore. And I don't know what to do with it." Kian smiled softly, his fingers briefly brushing Aryan's skin. "Maybe you don't need to do anything," he said. "Maybe we just need to stop fighting it." The words lingered in the air, and Aryan found himself at a crossroads. There was no turning back now, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Days passed, and the unspoken bond between Aryan and Kian grew stronger. Every glance, every touch, became more charged, more significant. They had crossed a line, and both of them knew it. But neither was willing to address it fully, not yet. The fear of what it meant was too much, but the pull between them was undeniable. One evening, as they sat in the office, discussing the final revisions, Kian stood up and walked over to Aryan's desk. His presence was almost overwhelming, and Aryan felt his pulse quicken. "We can't keep avoiding this," Kian said softly, his voice filled with something that bordered on desperation. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." Aryan looked up at Kian, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice strained. Kian's eyes softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on Aryan's. "I want you to stop running from this," he said quietly. "From us." For the first time, Aryan felt a sense of relief wash over him. The fear wasn't gone, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were finally facing the truth that they couldn't ignore any longer. It was late when Aryan finally gathered the courage to take the first step. He found Kian in the office, staring at the plans they had worked on together. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning. Aryan walked up to Kian slowly, his heart racing. "Kian," he said, his voice low but clear. "I can't pretend anymore. I can't pretend that I don't feel this. Kian turned to face him, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but also something else, hope. I'm not asking you to pretend, Kian said softly. I'm asking you to take a chance. To trust me. The air between them was thick with tension, but this time it felt like something was shifting. Aryan took a deep breath, then reached out, his fingers brushing against Kian's cheek. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Kian's eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened, the vulnerability in them took Aryan's breath away. Okay, Aryan whispered, his voice barely audible. Let's take that chance. And with that, the walls that had kept them apart finally began to crumble, leaving nothing but the two of them, ready to face whatever came next. The days following their decision to take a chance felt like a dream. Aryan and Kian continued to work together, but the dynamic between them had shifted. Every glance they shared, every touch, felt more intimate, more personal. There was no turning back now, and neither of them wanted to. One evening, after a particularly long day of finalizing the project details, Kian stayed behind in the office, just like the night before. Aryan had been ready to leave but found himself lingering, unable to walk away. He glanced at Kian, who was staring at the blueprints on the desk, deep in thought. Unable to stop himself, Aryan walked over to Kian and, without a word, cupped his face in his hands. Kian looked up at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, everything else faded, and Aryan leaned in, pressing his lips to Kian's. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant, but as their lips met again, it deepened, igniting a fire between them neither of them had been ready for. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. Kian smiled softly, a quiet laugh escaping his lips. Well, he said, his voice husky, that was definitely a good start. The morning after their kiss was strange, filled with an awkward tension neither Aryan nor Kian knew how to navigate. They had crossed a line, and now everything felt different. Work became secondary as both of them found their thoughts consumed by the lingering feelings from the night before. Aryan couldn't stop thinking about the way Kian's lips had felt against his, how his heart had raced with every touch. But as the hours passed, doubt began to creep in. Had it been a mistake? Was it something they could ever return from? Kian, for his part, seemed equally unsure. He would glance at Aryan when he thought no one was looking, but the look in his eyes was different now, vulnerable, unsure. They hadn't discussed what had happened, but neither of them could ignore it. Finally, after a long, silent meeting, Kian broke the tension. We need to talk, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Aryan nodded, his chest tight with anticipation. Whatever came next, they couldn't keep pretending like nothing had changed. When they finally sat down to talk, the air between them was thick with uncertainty. Kian broke the silence first. I don't want this to be a mistake, he said, his voice raw. I don't want to be just another one of your distractions, Aryan. His words hit Aryan harder than he expected, but they also cut through the fog of uncertainty. Aryan met Kian's gaze, his own voice just as raw. It's not a mistake, he said firmly. I'm just not sure how to do this. How to do us. Kian looked down, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. I don't know either, he admitted. But I'm willing to figure it out with you. The sincerity in Kian's words made something inside Aryan shift. He had been so afraid of the unknown, so afraid of losing control. But with Kian, there was a strange comfort, a reassurance that maybe this was something worth pursuing, no matter the risks. I don't know what comes next, Aryan said quietly. But I'm not walking away from this. Kian's eyes softened, and he reached out, taking Aryan's hand in his. Neither am I. Over the next few weeks, Aryan and Kian began to truly explore what it meant to be together. The work environment remained professional, but their private moments were filled with tenderness, each small gesture carrying more weight than before. They were learning how to balance their work lives with their growing relationship, and while it wasn't easy, it was real. Late one night, after a long day of brainstorming, Kian pulled Aryan aside. I've been thinking, he started, his voice quieter than usual. We've both had our share of scars, things that make us wary, make us afraid to let go. Aryan listened closely, his heart heavy with understanding. I know, Aryan replied softly. But with you, I feel like maybe it's worth it. Maybe we can heal together. Kian smiled, a mixture of relief and gratitude in his eyes. I've been thinking the same thing. The days ahead were uncertain, but for the first time, neither of them felt alone in their journey. Together, they were learning to trust, to love, and to heal, one step at a time. The day of the final presentation arrived, and Aryan and Kian stood side by side, their work finally complete. The tension that had once existed between them was now replaced with something stronger, something built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. Their professional success was a reflection of the journey they had undertaken together. As they stood in front of their colleagues, ready to present their final work, Aryan caught Kian's eye. A silent understanding passed between them, a promise that this was just the beginning. Their journey, both professionally and personally, had only just begun. After the presentation, when everyone had left, Aryan and Kian found themselves alone in the office again. The weight of everything they had shared, every struggle, every moment of doubt, hung in the air between them. And in that moment, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Kian smiled, his hand finding Aryan's once more. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked, his voice soft. Aryan squeezed his hand, a confident smile on his face. "Always," he said. And with that, they stepped forward, hand in hand, into the future they would build together.